Science, rationality, skepticism, thinking, physicality, these only happen within certain states of consciousness. Birth only exists within certain states of consciousness. Death only exists within certain states of consciousness. Science doesn't understand this, and science doesn't understand that science itself is a state of consciousness. All science is relative to this low state of consciousness that most of us are in most of the time. It's important to understand that there is no best state of consciousness and there's no invalid state of consciousness. So just because you have a higher or a lower state of consciousness doesn't mean the higher ones are better. Again, it all depends on, it's all relative, and it all depends on like what you want to do with it. If your desire is to understand the entire universe, then higher states are better. But if your desire is to live as a human and just do normal human stuff, then the high states of consciousness are not good for you. They're bad for you. If your desire is to maintain your sanity as a human, high states of consciousness are very bad for you. And there's nothing wrong with being in a human state of consciousness or being in a dog state of consciousness or a worm state of consciousness. They're all equally valid. They have their pros and cons. Spirituality basically boils down to changing your state of consciousness. Without changing your state of consciousness, spirituality doesn't make any sense. And it devolves into something stupid like organized religion. Most people have never experienced a high mystical state of consciousness, which was why there's so much confusion about religion and also about the nature of reality. Why both the religious people are so confused, but also the academics and the scientists and intellectuals, public intellectuals, are also so confused because they haven't accessed sufficiently high states of consciousness, and they're trying to do their best to understand reality from their current state of consciousness, and maybe they do a little bit of practice to expand it a little bit, but it's not sufficient, and they think they can just figure it out with their mind or through reading a book or through doing some math equations or doing some science experiments, and none of that will work. That's why I'm so stressing in this episode states of consciousness. I really want to communicate to you how important this is. This is the master key that unlocks everything. And if you don't use this master key, nothing else you do will compensate for that. You can't compensate for it by saying a bunch of Hail Marys and praying a lot and going to church a lot and doing good deeds and being nice to your kids and donating to charity and doing chanting, mantra, meditate. Like, none of that matters. None of that will compensate. Being the perfect Buddhist will not compensate for your lack of consciousness. So all religious teachings and religious wisdom and truths come from higher states of consciousness. That's where they come from. And then they get written down and degraded and corrupted and passed around society and culture by people who have never accessed those states of consciousness. And therefore, these religious teachings do not make a lot of sense for ordinary people because you're trying to interpret truths and wisdom and insights from very high states of consciousness, from super intelligence of like 1 million IQ points, and you're trying to understand that using your 100 IQ point capacities from this current state that you're in, and that's just, it's never going to work. There's way too much degradation. Way too much is lost in the narrow bandwidth. Way too much is lost in translation. And that's why you have people like Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, other folks who like to talk about religious topics or spiritual topics or even non-duality or psychedelics or whatever they talk about. in this domain, or science, or rationality, or logic, or language, or postmodernism, right? They talk about all these topics, but they're always just like, they're just going around in circles and very lost, very confused. And that, like, they do not have a clear enough consciousness because they haven't accessed those higher states. And yet they want to, like, make a whole career out of teaching these ideas and things to normies, to their audiences, and they're not able to do it. And no matter how much they do what they're currently doing, they're never going to make sense of it. Never. No matter how many scientific books they read, how many studies they run, how much neuroscience they do, none of it will ever be good enough. The only thing that will help them is to access those higher states. And of course, they have a lot of defense mechanisms to prevent them from accessing those higher states, because if they access those higher states, then many of the things they teach and their ideologies and their models and systems would all collapse. And also they would lose their minds in the process. So changing your baseline state of consciousness is very important. Accessing those higher peaks is also very important. And all of it takes a lot of work. It's all scary, it's all difficult, and it's dangerous. It's also dangerous. And therefore, almost nobody does it. And that's why society is in this state of ignorance. That's why we're living in the dark ages. There are some people who do this, but they're pretty rare. There's many different degrees of higher consciousness that could be accessed, but few people access the highest states. And even fewer people embody all those states. It's one thing to access, another thing to embody it. And so just, we're living in the dark ages.